Good morning. My name is Joe Sharma. I am an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Culinary Research Centre. I'm also the project lead for Feeding the City Pandemic and Beyond study, funded since May 2020 by the Toronto COVID-19 initiative. We are a team of academics and students working together to analyze the impact of COVID-19 on food systems and to explore present and future food solutions in collaboration with community stakeholders. This event is part of a series that highlights some community challenges and food resiliency initiatives that our Feeding the City project explores. Thank you all for joining us to discuss how concepts such as food sovereignty relate to the everyday livelihoods and motivations of food systems actors, such as the three ecological women farmers on this panel today. At a moment where many of us are expressing our solidarity with small farmers in India who are peacefully mobilizing against the threat of a state enabled corporate takeover of their lands and livelihoods, it is crucial for us to listen to the voices of those who feed our cities, our countries, and us. Please note that this public session is being recorded. Everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording by email at a later date. After this event, we also invite you to look over our student researchers' public-facing writings, that many of which connect to the food sovereignty concept that animates our roundtable today. They range from highlights on BIPOC community gardeners and school food programs in Canada to the pandemic situation of New York and Singapore food vendors. All of this is available on our website at feedingcity.org. Before we go on to introduce our panelists, please take a moment with us to acknowledge the land where we are located. Those of you with us for this webinar are no doubt situated in diverse Indigenous territories from across Turtle Island and many beyond. I want to recognize that the space where many of us work and live here in Toronto is the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently Mississaugas of the Credit River. We also recognize that such land acknowledgements as this do not exist in a past tense. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process. We call on each one of us to think of such relationships of land, peoples, power, intersectionality, and struggles for equity across and beyond the spaces where we see ourselves as belonging. Particularly relevant to us today is the Indigenous law of this land, Toronto to Kawartha, that lies in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that has bound people to share their territory and protect the land. I will now hand the mic over to my co-moderators. Sarah Elton is an assistant professor at Ryerson University and its Center for Studies in Food Security. Her doctoral research examined the everyday actions of newcomers to Canada who supported food sovereignty through community-based vegetable gardens. Brian Dale is a postdoctoral fellow at the Culinary Research Centre of the University of Toronto and the Feeding the City project. His doctoral research looked at strategies to expand ecological farming in Canada and the links between food sovereignty and the fight against climate change. Brian is also a non-farmer member of the National Farmers Union of Canada, the NFU, an organization to which each of our three panelists today belongs.
Thanks, Joe. Yes, I'm excited for today's conversation, and I am indeed a proud member of the NFU. Many farmers don't realize that they're able to join the NFU as what are called associate members as a way of supporting the organization and learning about their work. A little bit later, I'll try to remember to put in a link to the NFU's webpage, but it's nfu.ca. One of the key things that impresses me about the NFU actually is that the organization does important solidarity work, and that includes in terms of international struggles. Most recently, they put out a statement in solidarity with the farmers in India who are going through these atrocious legislative changes, but also solidarity work in terms of Indigenous food sovereignty, migrant agricultural workers issues, and those are just a couple of examples. We'll be talking about food sovereignty today. The NFU is one of 2 Canadian member organizations of La Via Campesina, the global movement of peasants, farmers, fisher folk, and Indigenous peoples who have been struggling for food sovereignty at the international level since the mid-1990s. As many people joining us for this webinar may be aware, the commonly heard definition of food sovereignty is that it is, quote, the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems, end quote. We'll be hearing from our panelists about what food sovereignty means to them, including in the context of their own farms. And so I will pass it over to Sarah to introduce our 3 panelists.
Good morning, everybody. Well, thank you, Brian. And I think it's important to note first that we have 3 women farmers with us today. And there are important gender dimensions to food sovereignty struggles around the world. There are gendered consequences for access to land, for example. And we also underline that it is relatively a recent development that women are actually recognized as farmers around the world, whereas this has not often been the case for hundreds of years. So with no further ado, I'll now introduce our speakers. I will be keeping their bios brief because they'll each tell you more about themselves and their farms in a moment. Sarah Bakker is a livestock farmer and co-owner of Field Sparrow Farms located near Bobcaygeon, Ontario. This farm delivers pasture-raised meats to the local community of Kawartha Lakes and to Toronto. Sarah is also the general manager of the National Farmers Union, Ontario. Liz Beesley is the co-owner of Joyfully Organic Farm, which offers organic vegetables to communities in the Greater Toronto Area through a community-supported agriculture, through a CSA program, and through farmers markets. She and her partner have overcome the significant challenges that young farmers face, such as land access, in order to grow a successful business. Jen Fenning is the co-owner of Fenning's Organic Farm. This is a company that grows, packs, and distributes organic produce from their farm near Waterloo, Ontario. The farm is celebrating 40 years of farming in 2021 with 3 generations of family at its helm. Jen is a vocal advocate for the rights of migrant agricultural workers, and she's also a counselor in her area. So before we launch into the discussion, just a little note about format. We'll be posing several questions to the panelists, questions that incorporate many of the suggestions that people made when they registered. We'll give each of our speakers a chance to respond with their reactions, and we will then have time for an audience Q&A at the end. So I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A box, which should be visible at the bottom of your screen. You're invited to type your questions into it. We will pose as many of them as possible to our speakers in the final part of our discussion. Let us begin.
So I get to ask the first question, and it's a big one, but how did you become a farmer? And at a high level, how have your farm operations changed since you began? And I guess maybe we'll go with Jen to begin with, if you don't mind.
Good day, everyone. I suppose it is still morning. The short answer to how I became a farmer is that it's I was born to it. My father has a PhD in horticulture, so I grew up in various types of farm and food production operations. I then married the son of a farmer who wasn't a farmer yet, but we joined the family business when our 3rd son was born. And that's been 24 years. So 24 years in the family business. How it's changed? Well, back when the Fennings first started farming in southwestern Ontario, they had 1 farm, and they grew mostly grains and a few vegetables and went to local farmers market. We don't do farmers markets anymore. Over the years, we increased vegetable growing and decreased grains. We only grow grains for crop rotation. Over the years, it's also evolved due to the things that have happened in the food world. So back in 1981, when my father-in-law and mother-in-law first started farming in Ontario, there wasn't such a thing as organic certification. My father-in-law and an uncle of mine were part of the group that first formed organic certification, the very first organic certification body in Canada. So we've seen developments in organic as far as in the market, and our business has been there along with it and changed over the years in various ways because of those evolutions of the market. We, in the early 80s and into the early 90s, went to farmers markets, like I'd said, and started selling to some small stores. The Big Carrot, which is no longer so small, but back then was pretty small. I believe that their anniversary date is 1 year after ours, or else it's the same as ours. But it falls very close to ours either way, and we've been very happy to be in business with them the entire time. We went through a stage where we did more when the kids were young. We didn't have enough energy as a family to market our products as much, and we thought it would be a great idea to sell to a distributor who could provide that direct to the store's access. And that didn't work so well, so we went back on the road with our own trucks, and today we have full-time truck drivers. We have up to about 140 people in the peak of the season, and we farm around 700 acres. Like I said, mostly vegetables with grains for rotation. The most recent evolution is that two of my sons are involved in the business, and one of Wolfgang and Regina's. So we farm as a family unit, along with all of the other wonderful people that work with us. And we have 35 Jamaican farm workers that are on the migrant worker program, the temporary foreign worker program. And I could talk much more, but I want to hear from everybody else. So.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Appreciate that. You know, you raise a lot of interesting themes that hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to, some at least over the course of the discussion. And I'll just kind of reinforce what Sarah Elton said earlier, that if folks want to, use the Q&A box, you can ask questions as they come to your mind. You don't have to wait for our Q&A period later. Liz, if you don't mind, I'll go to you next. Just going across the way that I'm seeing the screen.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, for me, I fell for farming quite a while ago, and pretty hard. I don't come from a farming background, but I think my way in, looking back, was kind of many years ago, as working on a question, I guess you could say, like a research question I was working on, that I personally was wrestling with as well, that had to do with how we involve our ethics, personally or societally, when in the process of growing food, and what that looks like when we choose to not, I guess you could say, cut corners, when to not, in the process, take advantage of the earth or the people involved in growing it, where there is an equity involved in it, and what that looked like. And I just sincerely didn't know the answer, or couldn't really fathom what that looked like from my, what I'd been exposed to in life so far. And kind of through that research, I came across ecological farming, and it seemed, from all kind of ideas and writing, that it could achieve just that, that it could do both, and the outcome was really admirable. And so, yeah, I became pretty hooked from kind of that point in, as an access point, and I soon just wanted to know it, and what that looked like in a tangible way for me to believe it, really to see it. And so I started to work on other organic vegetable farms around the province, to gain access and training and mentorship and to learn the trade itself. And, I soon fell in love with the work itself, what it feels like to working with my body, working hard, working outside really agrees with me. And kind of from then it's like we were quite hooked and knew that we were quite proud of what we were able to accomplish, what the work felt like, and then what it accomplished along the way. It just became incredibly satisfying and stimulating, and didn't want to do anything else other than that. So after training for a number of years on different farms around the province, then my partner and I took the leap of starting our own farm, our own operation, crafting the business plan of it and the ecological, the land footprint of it. And we took the leap to start Joyfully. How it has changed is it's been, I think the changing or the constant change that's been a big part of our early years was putting together the land footprint of Joyfully. To be honest, it's since we, as kind of first generation farmers, that was our biggest obstacle. Was once we had the training and the skills to do it, it was putting the land footprint together. Literally at the beginning was collecting little bits of land parcels to piece together enough land footprint to run an operation on. So it's that has been the most fascinating aspect of the journey to follow, is collecting it and putting together the land base that is Joyfully now. Once kind of getting over that, it felt like quite a mountain, to be honest. On the other side now, it's really satisfying to see what we've been able to accomplish, and now it's we're kind of in a chapter of celebrating and watching the momentum that Joyfully has been able to build, and the people that it touches, the customer base that it has its reach out to is really really wonderful to watch, and I'm quite excited about that community aspect of it now.
Thank you. Well, I'm thankful that you deliver to, or you sell at a farmer's market in my area, just as I can go to the Big Carrot and elsewhere and get Jen's carrots and other veggies. So I will turn it over to Sarah Bakker. Yeah, let's hear about you and Field Sparrow Farms.
It's interesting to hear how we all come from such different paths. So for me, I grew up in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, no farming background. And I married a Canadian and came up to Canada. I was doing marketing and fundraising in theater and private schools. And then we had some we met through mutual friends, another family who was looking for a rural property for their son who had some disabilities, so he could, have a little bit more freedom and flexibility than he did in Toronto. And so 4 of us ended up buying, basically it was a hobby farm together in the Kawartha Lakes. And there was a big garden that one of the families took care of, but there was some livestock there, some cattle and chickens. And that's kind of what my husband and I ended up sort of caring for a bit. I was still working off farm. And so we ended up with the opportunity to take over the lease from an Amish family who was moving away. So we took over their lease and were able to expand the cattle. And I always laugh because my husband we went to a slow food event and they were looking for a farmer's market, or they were starting a farmer's market, Sororan farmer's market. And the founders invited us to participate. And I was like, oh, I don't know if farmers markets are our thing. 10 years later, this is actually the first year we haven't done farmers markets, and I'll talk about COVID later. But so we expanded and we moved to grass-fed. We were just hobby farming, so we actually professionally started farming in 2008. It's based off my kid's birthday, so I have to remember which kid it's based off of. We started a year after my son was born, or it was 6 months. And so we started doing, like I said, the grass-fed beef, and we were on that rented land or leased land for about 5 years before we bought the farm we're on now in Bobcaygeon. And because we actually are able to live on the farm now, as opposed to that leased farm, we've been able to expand our operations. So we've added pork and pastured pork and pastured chicken. And sometimes we do turkeys, depending on the year. We don't this year just because, again, COVID. Really that's been kind of exploring this land and getting to know it and figuring out what works. It's this farm itself. We've been focusing on pasture renewal because basically the people before it were just taking off hay, which, you're taking all your nutrients and selling them off farm, by doing that. And so by now doing the pasture chicken and the rotational grazing with the cattle, we are focusing and seeing renewal in a number of the pastures. And that's an ongoing process, to keep that in balance and working on our soil health and continually improving it. So, and I still do marketing mostly for our farm. So that's a lot of what I do, but I love working with our cattle. We've moved from just buying stockers, which I don't know people's backgrounds on this call, but if you don't have a background, a stocker is basically 6 to 8 months old cow or cattle that you then finish raising on your property and then sell. So we used to just buy stockers, and now we've basically developed our own breeding herd, and we're working on some genetics. We just bought some red Galloway that I'm pretty excited about to see what they'll do on our farm, and and on the grass-fed program. So that's kind of been our path of it.
Thank you. Well, we all know we've been living through a pandemic. So our next question to you is, what are the most significant things that have changed for you this year because of the pandemic? And maybe we should start with you, Sarah, just because you mentioned COVID a few times.
Yeah, I mean, basically our farm itself, that stuff kind of stayed the same because, it's livestock. They still need to be cared for. That didn't change. But for us, literally overnight, our marketing changed. So we were selling primarily through farmers markets and through the Big Carrot as well. So yay, Big Carrot for supporting small farmers. So we had sent an email out to our customer list to say, okay, we're still planning on doing markets, but if you're not feeling comfortable coming to market, we will deliver to you. And then literally 2 hours later, we got an email saying, City of Toronto's pulled farmers markets permits. We can't have the market. Sorry, and more stuff. So Henry and I were like, all right, we're doing deliveries. And so we started basically sent an email out again to our customer base saying, all right, market's been canceled, but if we get enough orders, we'll do deliveries on Monday. And that's kind of where we started. We've ended up, moving to an online store and building up from there. But really it was that overnight piece. And what's been really awesome is I thought it was going to be mostly just a lot of our farmers market customers. We've actually, our reach has really extended. So we get new names all the time, and some of it is through advertising, through there was some government funding for moving online, so we did access that and have used that for some advertising. But I have been pleasantly surprised at the number of people who've been like, I can't make it to market, so I'm really happy you're here, and I'm really happy to have you do contactless delivery because we can just drop it off on their porch. And so that's really been the biggest change, is how we market our farm and how we sell things. And it's been really great. I feel slightly guilty saying that, this horrible pandemic has actually been beneficial for our farm, because this was probably a 5-year plan that, again, happened overnight, because we had the opportunity and we jumped on it. And in the early days, especially, we were getting lots and lots of thank you notes left out on porches and doorsteps. Thank you, and it felt really good to feel like we were providing that service for people who just couldn't, didn't want to hit grocery stores, couldn't access grocery stores. So that was really it reminded us of the value that we were providing people.
Thank you. And I just need to mention, since people keep talking about the Big Carrot, it is a store in the East End of Toronto that is a worker-owned natural food store that is dedicated to, according to their mission, local, organic, non-GMO, and sustainable food systems. Just to provide some context for those who are watching who don't know what we're talking about when we keep talking about the Big Carrot. Okay. Jen, would you like to go next?
Sure. So it's interesting. Our experience at the farm has been slightly different because we don't do the farmers markets. Obviously, that was something that wasn't impacted for us. The pandemic for us really hit March 13th when it was declared. We noticed that stores that we sell to had empty shelves. They had no potatoes. And I say it like that and sort of, still shake my head, because if anybody had ever suggested to me that at some point there would be a gap in supply of potatoes at any grocery store, I would have simply never believed it. So that was what started a little bit of a surreal season for us. We do have the Jamaican workers coming every year, and that was one of the first very serious challenges that we faced. The borders were closed, there were no flights. When the shutdown happened, every worker who was about to fly up here, and we're talking tens of thousands, had their process frozen. So all of their paperwork that was at the Canadian Embassy was simply abandoned, and the staff were sent home, brought home to Canada. When they opened up again, it was pandemonium. It was utter, unmitigated chaos. Paperwork was lost. And I don't say any of this to criticize or in any way put any negative attention to the individual people working in that system. This was not something that anybody could prepare for. And, I think about what it would look like if I was told at a moment's notice, essentially, and, we did know that the pandemic was coming and it was going to happen. But if I had to walk out of my office and leave everything and then try to come back to it a month later and pick up after I've, been flown home, separated from my family, quarantined, isolated, and then I have to pick everything up, I'm still worrying about my family. It's very understandable that balls were dropped and paperwork was lost in the shuffle. But for us, what that meant, it sort of left us in between. We didn't have the hardest hit of any of the farms because we don't have the early crops like asparagus and strawberries. Asparagus and strawberry growers particularly, and some other ones, were very, very, very badly impacted. Many acres of product simply could not be harvested. For us, the impact was that because our workers were delayed a significant amount of time, and they are team leads, they are our tractor drivers, they are the backbone of our workforce, in the sense that some of them been coming for 15, 16 years. So they have the experience and they work just as hard as we do. They are as invested personally in their attitudes as we are in our own farm. So missing that in the beginning of the season, is really setting off on a shaky foot. And it put our entire crop in jeopardy. We did have some impacts to our harvest, but thankfully the weather was not so bad. We did pretty well. It's always a bit of you hope you get rain in the right time, and you hope you get enough heat and enough sun, and sometimes one small area fares a little better than others. And we did pretty well this year for that. The bigger changes, probably the most impactful to me as a person and to the human side of our farm, was the loss of personal contact. So because we're such a big group, we had to, for caution's sake, risk reduction, we had to reduce our contact with each other. And that was very difficult. The emotional toll on our team is impossible to truly assess or read. And increased stress. We had team members who just were coping with a lot. Significantly increased demand, so that was a positive. It was really interesting to me to see how it changed the market, because we went from a society that eats out a lot. And we all knew that, or at least I did. And I think, I would say that probably Liz and Sarah, and certainly Brian, I know that that was the thing. But I was shocked at just how much, the reality of it, because when people stopped being able to eat out, the increased draw on the grocery stores and other food outlets that provide the raw ingredients was kind of like sucking too hard on the straw in your milkshake, and you hit some air pocket because you've just pulled a little too hard and you have to wait for it to melt. That's what we did to the food system. That's what the pandemic did. So it was really interesting to move through that and to see how people's anxieties were reflected through the buying patterns. We certainly saw impacts to our efficiencies with the need to clean and distance, and wear PPEs and source PPEs and source cleaning materials, and the government subsidies and rebates were certainly welcome for those things. And again, because we had decent weather and the increased demand, it was able to be offset. I feel like I'm going on forever, and but yeah, it's been an interesting year, and there's a lot we could talk about.
Thank you, Jen. Liz.
Yeah, I agree and leave the increased demand. It was certainly a real thing that we experience. I think all of us farmers experience, and that's been well noted here. So I'll leave that there. But I think the greatest impact I think that the pandemic had was that I think that if you asked me pre-COVID, what it was like to farm, to run a farm, to farm full time, I think I would have talked about how many hats you have to wear. And we have this saying around joyfully that says that, we talk about how farming asks you to not only farm, but to also be a mechanic, and to be a manager, and to be an activist, and to be a public speaker, and to be a bookkeeper, and to be a plumber and an irrigation specialist, and a customer relations and a marketer. It just asks you to wear a lot of hats. And I think, I'm sure all three of us would say that, as challenging as that is, it's also what keeps the work incredibly stimulating and satisfying. And we go to sleep at night feeling fairly proud of getting through another 24 hours or whatever, of all those hats. But I think I also would have said pre-COVID that I couldn't imagine wearing any more hats. like I was done, you know. And then this pandemic came along, and it did. It did ask us to wear even more hats, more layers. It asked of us so much on a mental, and I would agree, emotional level, to also be now managing the personal risk and safety of ourselves, of our farm crews, and of our eaters. And that just was incredibly taxing in that way. To still do all the previous hats, because, you know, irrigation lines still broke, and tractors broke down, and things like it still happened. But then there was this other level of, and I'm sure we'll all say it for a while now. I can, even as I say, I can still feel that weight on my shoulders of knowing how much pressure was on me in order to keep how many people, to keep them safe around me, from my smallest circles to my biggest circles, which is, you know, our customer reach. And yeah, I think, yeah, that has to be the biggest impact the pandemic had on our farm.
I think what a lot of what you've all said points to the fact that there are a lot of reasons that the pandemic has pointed to the need for a lot of profound changes within our food system. And so, you know, I mentioned earlier about the term food sovereignty, and terms like food sovereignty can actually seem academic to people who aren't so familiar with La Via Campesina and the global social movement that's behind the concept. So I guess this is a big question, but maybe you could just think about kind of some of your most important priorities. But, you know, what does food sovereignty mean to you in terms of your farm's operations, as well as your hopes for the future of our food system, especially here in Canada? And maybe, Liz, if you don't mind, I'll stay with you. You're a young face to farming, and you will be, you know, seeing a lot of these changes in the future. Hopefully, you know, changes for the better.
Sure. For me, I think food sovereignty in our context, in our farm operations context, for me has a lot to do with autonomy, and having autonomy to do what needs to be done, that for us to be able to grow our crops and sell them to our customers, to our eaters who are looking for them, and just and for that line to be consistent and to have full access and control over it, have autonomy. And I think the pandemic really shone a light on that, on all of our desires to be autonomous. I think a lot of us are, you know, enjoy, or sometimes are in farming for that reason of how much autonomy you do have. You work on this, you know, this own property where a lot gets accomplished, and a product gets started from seed, becomes something, and then moves off the farm and feeds someone. It's very tangible. It's very concrete. But I think when the pandemic hit, it just reaffirmed our desire to be autonomous, to be able to do that, and for nothing to be in the way of it. But it did, right? I think the pandemic really showed us that, you know, we would have thought of ourselves as pretty we're pretty direct to consumer sales, in that we operate through farmers markets, through a CSA, and some wholesale. And we've chosen those things along the line because we wanted to not be too vulnerable to the systems that can just pull a rug under you, and all of a sudden you're left very vulnerable. But when the pandemic hit, and it became obvious that all of a sudden farmers markets were canceled or not allowed to operate, we thought, you know, that was a shaky moment for us to see that, oh, we're not as autonomous in doing those sales that we really need to do and feeding those people. There's this, you know, there's a body in between us, and that body doesn't either can't or doesn't want to participate right now. And so then that puts this, you know, a big barrier between us and our customers. And so we then, you know, quickly sat down and addressed this food, you know, this farm sovereignty issue we had on our plates. And it encouraged us to think, well, what is the most autonomous path we have to doing what we need to do to farm, to feed people. And for us, it was our CSA, because each of those customers is directly ours. It's not mediated by some other party or other influence in between. We have a direct line, and we determine kind of the rules that it's going to happen under. Another party doesn't. So it certainly emphasized the need to have that food sovereignty, farm sovereignty, and we grew the CSA by quite a lot, and that was really the only way we felt confident in moving forward in the year, in planting the seeds and growing the crops and putting in the huge amount of effort it takes to pull off a farming season, just knowing we were on sure footing. And I think it had, this whole event has asked and shone a light on the same aspects for consumers. I think consumers have had the exact same experience, but just in reverse from us farmers. I think they thought, okay, where am I? I need to eat. And where is my farmer? And how much is in between me and my farmer? And I think, as the other farmers would say, I think before that maybe sometimes that question hadn't come across their mind, or they didn't realize how many systems are in between us and the farmers, say through a grocery store, and all the different the steps in between, and how many processes have to be just in place for them to get their food. And all of that became quite shaky, right? And it was shaking, and everyone could see it shake. And so a lot of people thought, oh, I'm really far from my farmer. Like, I'm really far from actually having access and being sovereign over my own food decisions and my ability to eat, because of all these systems, a lot of them very global, that they have no influence over, in order to get to see potatoes on the shelf at the grocery store. And so I think it was fascinating for us to see consumers see, okay, how can I shorten that line? I don't want to be so vulnerable to these shaky systems anymore. And how can I get closer to a producer? So going forward, I think that hopefully will be a continued conversation, because I think a lot of people saw the walls shake that didn't even realize the walls were there in the first place.
Thanks a lot. You raised a lot of important points, and I think that as you're saying, people have been realizing that there are these long supply chains, and it's not only in terms of distance, but the steps in between, them and the people producing the food that they're eating, and the corporations that are standing in between too. Normally, it's not the face of farmers that we see. I'll go to Sarah next to answer this question, if you don't mind, and in part because, Sarah, I see that you've got a poster behind you that's from the NFU about a roadmap to a post-pandemic food system.
Yes. It is, yes. I got an advanced version of it. Liz, your answer was awesome. I completely agree with a lot of what you said. And I'm going to come back to, I think, some of it, but I wanted to start for me personally. And I think if you ask my husband, he would have a different answer to this. But for me, a lot of kind of food sovereignty is about feeding my neighbors. One of the things I love about being a farmer is like feeding people, and even before I was farming, I loved having people over and sharing a meal with them, which touches on Jen and the lack of contact beyond, my immediate family. Like that is something I miss, and it didn't often happen in the farming season. But as we move into the winter season, which is quieter, I can't have people over and, chat about how their season went. But what I love, if you see us on Instagram, I'm always sharing, I'm trying to share recipes and things I cooked for my family, in the hopes that someone else, it might help them feed their family. And so that is really kind of when I think about food sovereignty, it's about the ability for, me as a farmer to feed my neighborhood, and my neighborhood, stretches 2 hours away into Toronto, but I still consider that like my neighborhood. It's like the people, in my province who I can feed. So that's kind of my approach on it. But much like Liz, I think I meant to say this when I talked about COVID impacts, but you reminded me, Liz, about that short supply chain. So again, that's part of, I think, food sovereignty is that short supply chain, that short, regional food systems are part of what, we're hoping to build and be a part of. But that whole abattoir crisis, it's been an issue. You know, lack of processing capacity for provincially certified abattoirs has been an ongoing challenge. The NFU's been working on it since 2005. I think we started the first campaign. But COVID, that's where we hit our wall, as you said, you know, because it was a mix of things. I think all the issues that were happening in the federal plants, which were the plants that tend to supply the grocery stores, meant there was less availability there. And so people were looking for alternatives for, you know, sourcing meat. And so, you know, they came to us. But all of us who are farmers were hitting the same abattoirs. We've been really fortunate in that we have both a large animal and a poultry abattoir within 20, 30 minutes of us. And the poultry one's always busy. We always book at the beginning of the year. But right now, we're looking at booking a year out for our large animals. And I don't even know if my livestock's going to be ready, but I've got to book a date, or else I'm going to book several dates and I might end up canceling some. So, you know, there'll be a waiting list and people can get in. But I think that, you know, when we talk about reliance on others, I think that's kind of where, you know, I think it's easy to talk about regional food systems, but sometimes we forget that, you know, I can sell directly to a customer, but I still rely on, you know, the feed to be delivered. We don't grow our own feed. You know, we do buy and feed. I rely on, you know, my abattoir, you know, I rely on all these other players that, when I think about my own self-reliance, I think, oh, I grow my own food. I sell it directly to farmers, you know, to customers. That's great. But it's like, no. There's all these other pieces that go in, which, can really impact our food sovereignty. And so I think, again, with livestock, that abattoir piece, which, you know, to put in a plug, the NFU is working on. We have a campaign going now where I met with Minister Hardeman about it recently, but my work hat, but with my farm hat on, it's definitely a big concern. And, you know, much like we're seeing challenges with farmland succession and, you know, the age of farmers getting older and not, you know, and looking to turn over farmland, we're seeing the same thing in abattoirs. But instead necessarily of having farmland, it's abattoirs that are just closing their doors because it's easier to do that than to find someone to buy it and take it over. And there's all sorts of reasons, and we could have a whole nother webinar on that, but that's the big kind of gap I see in our own food sovereignty here it's really across Canada, but, you know, here in Ontario specifically, for sure.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important and obvious things that many consumers, you know, as non-farmers would not necessarily be aware of this issue of abattoirs and the importance of having trained butchers and so on who do that work. Jen, your thoughts about food sovereignty and the future of our food system? Not too big a question, but.
I think that question could be worth, you know, we could probably talk about that for the rest of the day. You know, settle in, let's get some food. I really love all the points that both Liz and Sarah brought up, and you too, Brian. And there are a couple, so, you know, talking about how we as farmers are reliant on we think of ourselves as pretty autonomous, but we are still reliant on things, and sometimes we forget just how vulnerable we are, and our sovereignty is threatened. Seed. So vegetable seed is grown in very, very small portions of the world, and I sort of feel like we stand on one foot. You know, the whole putting all your eggs in one basket, well, that's a really important basket. So I think that for me, when I'm thinking about sovereignty, food sovereignty, I think that seed sovereignty is a really big piece of that. And I think it's really important for us to be conscious of the provenance of seeds and how we in Canada especially can't actually produce most of the seed that we use for vegetables. Obviously for grains and that we are able to, and potatoes and some certain crops. But for vegetables, specifically carrots, carrot seed is, there are some very small producers, but not there's no substantial amount of carrot seed grown in Canada. In a larger context, for me, the food sovereignty, if we want to have independence as a nation, we have to be able to feed ourselves. And Canada is really, because of all of the ways that we've decided to go about feeding ourselves, we've put our food sovereignty as a nation at risk. And, you know, every time that there's, when the borders were closed after the 9/11 and now this pandemic, one of the things that came up as a first concern was, if the US is hit really hard with this pandemic and workers are not able to plant and harvest crops in the US and Mexico, our food supply in Canada is threatened. What does that mean to our sovereignty as a nation? And, you know, both Liz and Sarah, I think, have talked really a lot about the personal, and I fully agree and resonate with everything that you guys said. So I don't think I need to add to that. But I think one of the other areas that puts our food sovereignty in this area at risk is the social perceptions of farm labor. And, you know, I thought with this pandemic that we would have the best year ever for hiring local people to work on the farm. Nope. Really short answer. Nope, that did not work out the way I expected it to. We have always had a great local team and a fairly large local team, but most of them are immigrants from India by percentages. We do have a small number of sort of Canadian born for generations, Canadian young people, students or, you know, sort of young people who are in various stages of their life that they're not going back to school and they have an interest in farming. And we've had some really phenomenal people in that category. But yeah, it's a really interesting and challenging conversation. I think one of the other things, you know, profitability is part of food sovereignty, and the picture for food sovereignty is as it relates to farming. And, you know, the NFU's work on that is something everybody should read. The global context puts us in competition with areas where costs of production are very different, and there are different climate and weather challenges. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about how food systems have evolved is that, you know, back 100 years ago when food wasn't being trucked all around the world so much, if an area were suffering a drought or some bad adverse weather that impacted food supplies, farmers were able to demand an increased price for the crop that they did achieve to harvest in that year. And that is no longer the case. If our crop is wiped out, the gap in the market is quickly filled from somewhere else, and we do not see a bump in our price at the gate. And that's a big challenge for profitability, I think. But to talk about La Via Campesina, you know, globally, we all have far more in common with every farmer around the world than we have with the urban centers right next to us. You know, our daily lives are challenged the same way. And I am really, really honored to be able to be part of La Via Campesina and through the NFU. It's a bit of a word salad and sort of I'm not as organized as I want to be, but yeah, I could talk about food sovereignty for a long time.
Thank you, Jen. We're going to turn a little bit of a corner, and you know, some statistics have suggested that the majority of new ecological farmers are women, and what role would you say women are playing in advancing food sovereignty and ecological farming in the Canadian context? Does anyone want to volunteer to go first, or?
I will. That's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think, so I have this theory, and I have not done any academic research, so you academic researchers can tell me if I'm wrong. But I guess my theory has been sort of, women have been involved in farming, since the first person put a seed in the ground. And so I think, traditionally it was done in probably, family, either with a spouse or, part of a family. But then, in the I'm going to say 50s, especially when farming became industrialized, it became commodified, it became, it kind of became the arena of, a male arena, right? Because it became a business, right? As opposed to how you fed yourself, how you fed your neighbors, like I was saying. And so I think that's when we saw the role of women kind of either devalued or not, or taken out of farming. And so I think what we're seeing is it kind of coming back as we looking at agriculture through a different lens, and looking at how we can revalue, the role of all the players on the farm. And I think too, Liz mentioned kind of that independence. And I think what I'm also seeing is kind of to build on that is farming is becoming a bit more accessible. I recognize that, access to land is a huge challenge, but, with the rise of farmers markets and the increased visibility of them, I think it's easier to run a farm at a scale that is appropriate for an individual, right? Or although you, like Liz said, you have to wear a lot of hats, so many hats. But I think, and so it is, it's those kind of two pieces, kind of this historical kind of revisioning of what agriculture looks like across the sector, and then the revaluing of that direct marketing piece. So that's my kind of shortish answer, but yeah.
Thank you. Liz, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think it's been interesting to reflect on this question because I think what jumps out at me is that I think it might not just be a women's issue, I think, in my answer to this, because I think we're kind of looking at a contrast where my mind goes to kind of, I'll say the lack of a better term, like the dominant agricultural culture for kind of what we've been building this country on and who has been running the farms and the sizes of their farms and their farming methods and their farming resources and their capital. We let that one model of agriculture really kind of run wild and get quite big. So I think it's gotten to a point and to a size that it's quite inaccessible for a lot of people to jump into that version of agriculture. And it is dominated by a particular gender, a male gender, but it is also dominated by a certain ethnically looking group of people. Like it became a bit not diverse. It kind of got, it's becomes the kind of the stereotype version of agriculture that we perpetuate in media and photographs when people think about farmers and what they look like. So I think what's interesting about ecological farming is that it even though it has a very, very steep learning curve in terms of its skills they have to acquire, and you kind of have to go get them yourself in a way. The ecological farming method is a little bit more accessible, I think, to a lot of different populations that have been left out of the dominant agriculture narrative in the last few decades. So whether it be women or other marginalized populations or landless men who didn't come from that type of culture, there are more doorways open, I would say, for for us to get in that way, and for us to thrive and be seen as, you know, a different face of farming out there. So I think that's an interesting aspect of ecological farming, and it provides that avenue that maybe, to put it together, I'd say that it's just the dominant agriculture method is just incredibly capital requiring and intensive for you to start, and right, and so that's not available to a lot of folks, and so, but ecological farming doesn't have that necessarily that same requirement, and so now I think we're starting to see faces that we didn't see before, which is really exciting.
Thanks, Liz. Jen?
This is a really interesting one for me, because I've had a difficult time viewing myself as a feminist for most of my life. And I'm a mother of boys. So the next generation of our farm is boys. But it is, I think, you know, I absolutely, the relationships and the ability to engage in farming and the farming conversation within the NFU, I think is such an incredible gift. And I know that it's talked about, but maybe the academics can say how much, you know, what are the statistics on the women versus, I don't know what they are. I think that from an anecdotal perspective, and whether it's nurture or nature, you know, we could argue about, women are bringing a more inclusive perspective generally. So we think we've been socialized to think about nurturing other people, think about nurturing our communities. And I think that it extends itself almost seamlessly into thinking about nurturing the soil that feeds our crops, because it's no different. It's, you know, it's just a continuation of the same type of nurturing. And understanding that all things are connected is something that I think from the way that women have been socialized over, I would say probably millennia, as mothers, and motherhood has been so much ingrained in our identity, it flows. But I think that there's a possibility that that will change, because as men are being raised, and I think about my sons, you know, they're raised to be nurturers as well. And they think in their conversations, when they're talking about nurturing the soil and feeding the community and the connections between all of the parts of the farm that are holistic and inclusive, they have the same kind of language around it that historically we hear from women more. So I think that maybe that's going to change. I think that it's more, and Liz, you sort of touched on this a bit, and it kind of, you know, shifted a few of the things that I was thinking to say. I think that it's more about a perspective and just that inclusion and nurturing that is much more accepted to be from men as well today, where maybe when I was a child and going back further, it was much more the woman's domain, and men were, you know, very squared off and didn't talk about their feelings, and, you know, nurturing was for the mothers. I think you guys gave phenomenal answers, and I'm not sure I'm giving the best.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think I agree that that you all raised very important points, and that makes me think about, terms that have been raised in the midst of the pandemic around what is essential work. And Jen, you're making me think of how farming is care work as well, and I like how you extend that to soils, not just people. So the next question, actually, Liz especially, but you've all been kind of anticipating some of the questions that we're going to get to, but also the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A box, which is great. So this next one just steps a little bit away from the question of gender. There have been a lot of important issues raised this year about racial justice and justice for Indigenous peoples, including in terms of the food system specifically. So what are the things that farmers like yourselves, who are trailblazers in your own right, can do to support food sovereignty for BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color? I'll let you jump in if anyone wants to, has a specific thought that they want to share. Go for it, Jen.
Thanks. These are all great questions, and wow, well done. I think, from there's just so much to unpack in that question alone. Connecting with the local IBPOC people to find out what the local needs are, I think that's a really important first step. Because a lot of times what we've seen is sort of the white savior, where we perceive ourselves to have the answers. And part of my childhood that I didn't talk about, I was a missionary kid. So my family lived in sub-Saharan Africa, and my father ran a farm on a mission, and the mission, the goal, his purpose of being there was to feed the people. And I looking back on it now, I think, feed the people. These people have been living here for it's sub-Saharan Africa. That's the cradle of humanity, millennia upon millennia. I think they know how to feed themselves. If we just leave them alone and let them know, So that has formed a lot of how I approach these conversations. And these sorts of issues. But it's really important, I think, for us to take a step back and ask with an open heart and an open mind. Engage in conversation, engage in just a sharing of ideas about food and food systems with each other. And then it flows from that naturally. So some of the sort of projects and ideas that I have and that I'm working on are talking with Indigenous communities here about what crops might be relevant to them. So, this is what we're growing. We're growing very, very European-centered, European-focused types of crops. But what could it look like if we included some crops that are very much more relevant to an Indigenous community or immigrant communities or communities of color of any kind? And there are grants available for projects and partnerships with groups. Land sharing is something that I think we should be talking more about. The original treaties were all about sharing the land. As farmers, we're good at that. We're good at sharing with our neighbors. So, I think we can start to talk to the Indigenous community in our area about what does land sharing look like, and how could it work for both parties. Gleaning is another one that is a historical thing that's been around forever. And I think that's a really good way to help to serve communities that have a harder time accessing food. And I think internships are really important. Paid internships. I don't believe in unpaid labor. And I know, Brian, we've had that that's a whole other webinar right there too. But that's you know, those are some of the ways that I think about approaching it.
Thanks. Those are amazing thoughts. Yeah, and as you're saying, Jen, all of this stuff is interrelated, and we could expand on all of this, and maybe we'll do that someday and have a full day session with you three. But in the meantime, yeah, just your thoughts. I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, my exploration around this has been sort of more personal in some ways, because I am very conscious as a white woman who would never have described myself as privileged. You know, my journey has been sort of recognizing that privilege and, you know, thinking about what that's looked like in my farming journey. You know, the fact that, you know, I do have a university education, that I, you know, have family who helped me purchase this land, and all of those pieces, and kind of trying to recognize that. And then my other piece is really kind of shutting up about it and listening, you know, so I don't know as anyone needs me to tell them how to interact with you know, BIPOC people. So I guess similar to Jen in that listening to the community and hearing those needs. I struggle because, you know, I live near Bobcaygeon, and it is very white. It is what I miss about living in Toronto, you know, that, you know, there was a huge diversity of people in Toronto, and here there's a handful of people of color, and that sort of includes all the categories. And it is, I am conscious, again, raising children, that, you know, especially, you know, like a son, you know, who, how can I make sure they are listening to a system in which they will be privileged, and how can I make sure they are calling out that system when it's appropriate? So those are the conversations we have. So it's, you know, I guess it's hard because I don't have answers for this one. I think it's really a journey and a process. Yeah, I don't know what it looks like for our farm. I'm still definitely in that exploration piece of it, and I'm open to hearing more from others, because I feel like there's a lot of work to do, and you know, the systemic part of it sort of sometimes overwhelms me, because it's like, how do you fix a systemic problem? How do you fix, you know, police brutality? You know, how do you address all of that when it's like, this is me on my farm, you know? And so I think it's like kind of looking to again, maybe amplify voices and figuring out kind of how I can, what my little role in it can be, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, it can be overwhelming, and of course, white supremacy, and just as with patriarchy and colonialism, it doesn't get changed overnight. But yeah, it's a longer term struggle. Liz, your thoughts?
Well, in the bigger sense of farming and what we're talking about today, farming is a land-based system, and so to have any type of food equity, we have to have land equity. I think is fundamentally the biggest issue that we need to work on if we do want to see any changes for all of these communities to have any food sovereignty over their own farming systems and their own food systems. They have to have the same land equity and access to it. And so we, I believe, as a nation, have to take way more control over this topic for anything really to get done, because right now it's a free-for-all for land. It's whoever has the most and has the biggest buck and has the biggest bid on that piece of land gets it. So that is going to continue to happen, and then therefore be run by a very small group of people, and they're not a diverse group of people. So we have to address that, I think, as a nation. We have to get in the trenches of preserving agricultural land. We can't let it just fall the way that it just happens to fall into the hands that it happens to fall anymore, or we're not going to see any changes. We have to get better at preserving agricultural land and taking leadership, therefore, over where that land goes to, and that it goes to farmers, and it goes to Canadian farmers and all the faces of Canadian farmers.
Thanks, Liz, especially for raising the issue of land and in the context of this week, what's happened in Ontario with at the provincial level and threats to agricultural land that continue. So thank you for your interesting responses to our questions. Now we have questions from those of us who have, those of you of the audience who joined us today. And so we're going to turn the discussion over to audience questions at this point. Just a reminder that questions can be submitted through the Q&A box. I'm going to start with a question of Shah Mohideen. And the reason, I think they're connecting to a report that was just released this week from the University of Dalhousie and the University of Guelph, predicting a spike in food prices, vegetables going up by 4.5 to 6.5% prices in the next year, meat 4.5 to 6.5% also in the next year. That's the predictions. So I'm going to piggyback a question on to Shamoidin's question. First is this the case? Obviously, this is an accounting of mainstream food systems. So are alternative food systems like the ones you are a part of, are we looking at a similar price increase? And the question that is posed is, what could be a solution? Like how, or you know, what is a solution for this, for price increases? But maybe that price increase might be representative of something else. So I'm opening that up.
I don't know if I can answer that. It's okay. I don't know if I can answer the price increase question. I mean, partly how we set our prices, because we're direct to consumer, is based on our cost of production and how much it costs us to raise our meat. So you know, but if abattoir prices spike or feed prices spike, then you know the cost of production goes up, and so we do need to make a living at this. But my thing, and if you've talked to me for 5 minutes about this, you probably heard me say this, but I always talk about, when we talk about food accessibility, which I think is maybe where that question is going, is I want to talk about making people, I don't want to talk about making food affordable. I want to talk about making people able to afford food. And the difference in my mind is that when we talk about food affordability, it often comes down to the farmer and reducing our price. And, you know, we really end up being price takers, which we talked about under the food sovereignty piece of it. And that's not really an accessible model. I want to talk about basic income, and I want to talk about having people able to afford the food they want, the culturally appropriate food. I want them to be able to afford that, no matter what pricing does, you know. So I think that's kind of my take on that question.
Thanks, Sarah. So shifting towards looking like a solution being income supports, basic income, so that people can afford to pay farmers for food.
Mm-hmm.
Liz.
And Liz was unmuted. I don't know if
Liz, did you want to jump in next?
No, I think Sarah did a great job. That's exactly where my mind was going as well.
Any solutions that you see to this question? It's a bit of a quagmire, really. Jen?
I would say that Sarah's answered it really well, and I'm fully on the same page with her. You know, we need to stop looking at farming as something that's should be a charity, and yeah, I 100% agree. It's not that we are charging too much for our food; it's that people's basic incomes have been eroded.
Thank you.
I'll jump in with the next question, if that's okay. I saw Sean asked one, hello all, what kinds of policy innovations at the provincial level would help promote food sovereignty for Ontario? We've seen recently how our international suppliers, especially in the US, can be unreliable. Should policies be directed at subsidizing production of foods that we usually import, or directed at consumers to help defray the usually higher costs? Anyone want to jump in? Policy interventions? Go ahead, Jen.
Well, this is something that I love this conversation. I mean, you know, it ties right in with what Sarah said about income supports and looking at basic equality for people. Unfortunately, what we have right now is a system that has artificially depressed the profitability of farms and depressed the perception of what should be the cost of food and what should be the remuneration for labor to produce it. And part of that issue is, you know, why I engage with the migrant worker program in the way that I do. In order for us to have a food system that is actually fair and just and can start to address some of the issues. Boy, this is a big one. I don't know how to wrap this into a couple sentences, but I think a really important piece of our food system is that we have too many people who are not free in the way that we think that people should be free. And the temporary foreign worker program, we have to transition that to a just program that allows people who are qualified and willing to farm in Canada to come here and be equal participants in every aspect. And I think that that will start to shift the balance towards a more equitable food system in Canada. How do you do that in the context of the world where you have temporary foreign worker programs or similar programs around the globe and people on the move for them? We don't have time for that today, but I think that's a really key piece for me.
Thanks, Jen. Sarah?
Maybe I'll just jump in. So mine's completely different. I agree with Jen. I think that's great. And maybe I just, because you mentioned, the questioner mentioned provincial policies, again, to harp back on abattoirs, I think looking at regulatory burden on especially provincially certified abattoirs, which limits their expansion and their growth. I mean, I think that limits, that limits access to food, especially in Northern Ontario. It's really hard to grow chicken at a small scale because there's very few poultry abattoirs in Northern Ontario, and driving 3 hours or whatever to get your chickens processed. I mean, there are people doing that, driving 3 hours to get chickens processed. And that's a huge cost in time and gas and, resources. And so I think if we can look at what we can do to keep, obviously we want food safety has to be, the number one issue. We do not want to make anyone ill with the meat that's being processed at certified abattoirs. But I think looking at that regulatory burden, labor, again, abattoir labor is a big issue too. And, it's not the most fun job. And so I think looking at that too. So I would say if we're looking at policy interventions there, that's kind of, again, not a little bit different from what you're asking, but something that could be addressed.
Thanks, yeah. Another concrete example. Liz, did you want to add anything? We have another question lined up, but do you have any thoughts on this before we go on?
Yeah, I would encourage those who are listening today that we've brought it so many different issues that are very pertinent to food. Food is complex and there's a lot of angles on it. So there's a lot of policies that need to be worked on. I would just encourage that anybody listening today, not rest their morals at waiting for policy to change. I think that kind of change only happens when the pressure is put on by the people. And so I would say that I think we're bringing up a number of topics, and if any of one of them resonate with you on a level, or got your blood pressure going, and you want to see something different, then I wouldn't necessarily wait too long. I would take it up, and I'd put the pressure on in your local region or your provincial region, because there's a lot of these issues that are hot right now and need voices behind them from every level, and I think that's the people listening today can have a big influence on them.
Thank you so much. I just realized that in the excitement of hearing all this amazing conversation, we should actually probably wrap it up and going to another question. I'll start by saying thank you so much, Liz, Sarah, and Jen, for the amazing conversation. I'm just going to share a slide so that folks can see what we have coming up next. But really, this has been our third webinar. We've been putting the recordings up on our YouTube channel, which I shared in the chat. But this has been an excellent conversation. And as you said, Liz, just there, that was kind of a nice kind of thought to end on, because you've raised so many important points, and there's so much more kind of research and exploration. And we mentioned the NFU, and NFU Ontario has been doing a lot of great work on some policy issues and so on. And so if people are interested in exploring these, then they can certainly dig further. But we've covered a lot in just under 90 minutes. I want to thank also, before we wrap, Jackie Roel, postdoc fellow at the Culinary Research Center with me, who's been helping behind the scenes, and Steve Biordi from UTSC as well, who has been assisting with technical logistics. So stay tuned for these upcoming webinars that I've put up on the screen. The details will be announced, and we'll be sharing them with folks who have registered via email. But we have one which is a partner webinar with the Fledge Research Group and the NFU on supporting farmer livelihoods in January. In February, we'll have one on community food networks, including food box pop-ups, newcomer and neighborhood and halal groups, and student initiatives. In March, we have one on some of these themes we've raised today on Black and Indigenous food sovereignty. This is a dialogue with Ashante Reese and Tabitha Robin, also known as Tabitha Martins. That's in partnership with the Culinary Research Center. And in April, we'll have a webinar featuring voices from the restaurant and hospitality sector, so including folks in Scarborough, Toronto, and New York. And so our websites are there at the bottom. Put up our handle for our social media accounts. And so, please do to keep in touch with us. And thanks to everyone for attending and joining us today. And as I mentioned, please do keep an eye out for the actual recording. We'll send a link if folks want to share that. Once that's available, then we will make sure that you can kind of reflect on some of these thoughts that Liz and Sarah and Jen have been sharing today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.